What's up, guys? Chris Schwartz-Edmondson here from Schwartz-Edmondson Web Design. Welcome back to this video series where we're going from a mock-up to the final build in Squarespace. In the last video, we looked at setting up the typography, color palette colors, and setting up all of the different color themes in Squarespace 7.1. So in today's video, I've already built out the site in Squarespace. So I want to go over the tips and the tricks that I've used to bring this mockup to life in Squarespace. So there's going to be a lot of good learnings in this video. Let's jump right in. So looking at this mockup in this first section here, there is a lot going on when you initially look at it. So we have this big heading here. We have a subheading with a lower highlight. We have this fixed element over here. This was requested to be fixed to the left-hand side of the screen. So as you scroll down, it would stick to the edge of the screen and scroll, but only on the home page. And then this design word right here was requested to be rotating text. So it'll loop through a bunch of different words. In terms of the design itself, we have the image over here, and then we have this tagline here. And notice that the image goes full bleed off the edge of the screen. Since Squarespace has padding in their sections, like content doesn't just go to the edge of the screen, I knew that the first thing that I wanted to try would be to have this image here actually be part of the background image. But the problem with that is this tagline here. So as the screen scales, the background image also scales with the section, and the tagline doesn't stay under the photo. So then I tried making the tagline part of the background photo as well. But on mobile, the text goes over the photo. You could tell this tagline here was actually not real text and it was part of the background. So there was just a lot going wrong with that type of approach. So I took a step back and I approached it a different way. So the way that I broke it up was actually not as one section, but as kind of three different sections. So I looked at this content as like one section here, as one section here. And then for this overlay element, I decided to put that in its own section as well. So I'm splitting up this first section actually into three separate sections. And the reason that I decided to do that was because we needed to make sure that this image was all the way to the edge of the screen. It was easier to separate these into separate sections and put the two sections next to each other, as opposed to trying to keep these in the same section, removing the padding over here. You know, the words would have shifted over as well. Yeah, there's just a lot that can happen when all of this content was, if it were to be in the same section. So I felt like this approach of splitting it up into three sections was actually a really good option, and it's what I ended up going with. So if we jump over into Squarespace, you can see my final build here. So I've put these two sections next to each other. So you can see this is its own section here, and this is its own section here. And then we have this third section down below with the little icon here. So the way that I put these pages next to each other was using CSS from my course, Custom Layouts in Squarespace. It's all about split layouts, putting pages next to each other with Flexbox. So if you're interested in creating these types of designs, then you can definitely check that out. So what I did is I had this content in its own section. And for the rotating text, if I full screen this, you'll see that this is actually looping through to a bunch of different words here. And the way that I did that is I have a code in my shop. It's called Rotating Text Plugin. And so this is just taking place in a code block. And we have all these different words that we want to loop through here. And then down below, I'm doing this low highlight with CSS from my course, CSS Toolbox. So I cover how to do a low highlight like that. So you can see all of this content is really, it's just a code block. And I've used a spacer block to kind of just bump it up a little bit so it looks more centered with this image over here. And then over here on the right, I have a spacer block to make sure that my content is just spaced down below the header enough to match the mockup. And then this is just an image block. And what I did is I just saved the sparkle as part of the image. So you can select both in Illustrator and then export the selection as a PNG. So that's exactly what I did for this content. And then this is just a text block here down below. And so the nice thing about this approach is that if I hit done and then I go to the mobile view, the content just stacks from left to right. So now this section stacks on top of this section and our text wraps under our image, and like everything just looks really nice on mobile, which is, you know, obviously very ideal. And I didn't have to do any mobile media queries for this content to get it to look right on mobile, just because I've done my work ahead of time and set it up in a nice way like this. So that was my approach for this first section. Again, splitting it up into two different sections, and that way I can actually have an image and I can actually have text. And I forgot to mention, I did remove the padding on this section here so that the content can be all the way to the right. So if I get out of edit mode, you can see the image jumps all the way to the edge of the screen, and that's because every page has padding on the left and the right. So if I inspect, I can show you guys that. On the content wrapper class for a section, you can see the green here is the padding on either side, and ordinarily that would prevent the content from going all the way to the edge of the screen. But you can see there's no green on the right-hand side of this element because I've set the padding right to 0. You can see that right here. So that's how I got the image all the way to the edge of the screen. So that was my approach for this first section. And then down below, as I mentioned before, I made this in its own section. This is just actually an image block. So if I pull up this image here, we can see that I have the circle and it's a PNG image, but I've saved extra space on the left and the right of the image. I have that like blank space baked into the image. And the reason for that is when we go down to mobile, images become full width. And if I had just cropped the image all the way to the edges of the circle, this would just be a giant circle here. And obviously that wouldn't look good. So by saving blank space in that PNG image, I've made sure that it doesn't get too big on mobile. That took some playing around in terms of knowing how much blank space to save in the photo. At first it got too small on mobile, so that took some playing around. And so this section you can see it's just an image block and it's just a spacer block sizing that image for desktop. And then for the gradient background, I went to background and I went to art and I chose this gradient section. And I chose my start color and my end color. And then if you go to shape and size, if you set the start position and the end position to the same amount, then the line isn't like a blurry gradient, it's just a perfectly sharp line. So that's how I created that illusion of the first section and the second section meeting. It's actually just a gradient background of the same color. You might have noticed there's no space between this section and the section above it. And that's because I've aligned this section content to the bottom and this section content to the top. And I'm doing a cool trick. It's a little hidden Squarespace trick that removes the padding from top of sections without CSS. And I'll get more into that as we go down the page. I'll explain that more in this section here. So that's a technique that I use a lot when I'm doing this type of splitting content that looks like it's in the same section into two sections. I forgot to mention in the first section, this is just an image block here that is in this section, and I've used CSS to fix it to the edge of the window. Okay, so moving down to this section, this is super straightforward, doesn't really deserve any time. Just a normal section, it has a text block, and then these X's are just an image block. Moving down to the next section, again, this is a very straightforward layout. I have a text block here on the left. I have a spacer block, just kind of spacing it out a little bit. Originally, this content was kind of creeping up behind the text, so adding that spacer block there just kind of gave me a little more breathing room between the background decoration and this text. Because you'll notice if I edit the background image, what I've done is I've saved this background shape and the split colors as part of the background image, and then these shapes down here are also part of the background image. So that design, it looks kind of complex in the mockup. If you're like, oh man, like how would I recreate this? I literally just came in here and selected all these elements and then right click, export selection, and just saved it as a background image. Super, super easy. And then for this text content, that was just a text block. This is a rotating gallery, so I used a gallery block. So if we jump back into Squarespace, you can see I'm just using a gallery block set to slideshow. And so that way it can auto rotate through all these images. And then I've just used a little bit of CSS to place this decoration here to the top right of the gallery block. And to do that, I can jump into my custom CSS window. I have all of my CSS here for this site. And if I go down to my homepage styling section, in the homepage gallery decoration here, so this is the CSS that fixes the little decoration here to the top right. So I'm using a pseudo element to place this background image, this PNG here, just to the top right of this gallery block. And I've selected the gallery block using the block identifier extension. It's super helpful, and that way I can just grab the block ID and then add my CSS to that block. Again, really super simple section. If I go down to mobile, you can see everything looks really nice. Everything is stacking properly. Everything is really readable. So far the mobile design is looking really good, and I haven't even done any mobile specific CSS, which is awesome. Okay, so going down to the next section. So this section was a fun challenge, and there's a cool Squarespace tip that I want to share with you. So looking at the mockup, again, we have this full width content going to the edge of the screen. So right off the bat, I knew this is either going to have to be a background image, or it's going to have to be in its own content section so that I can make this content go all the way to the edge. Okay, so if all of this content was in one section, then if I made this section not have any padding to the right in order for this content to be able to go all the way to the edge, then this content would also go all the way to the edge. So that's why I knew this had to be either a background image so that I could just save this whole thing as a background image, and that way this content could go all the way to the edge of the screen. But what I found was on mobile, this image was cropping, and so the who we work with would be cut off. So after I tried to make it part of the background image, what I ended up doing is just splitting this content into two different sections. So instead I approached it like this, where this content would be its own section and then this content would be its own section. And the section bottom actually looks like this, because then I thought, okay, well, I'll just make this part of the background image for this section. So I decided to make this in its own section, and then I saved this as an image block, export selection, saved it as a PNG, and that way I could just drop it in to the section above. And then this content, again, just had it in its own section with text blocks, and then I used CSS from my CSS Toolbox course to add the custom bullet points. So if we jump back into Squarespace, you'll see, maybe get a better idea of how I approached this. So again, this is its own section. Here we have an image block, and it's just being sized with a spacer block here. And then down below, this is a text block. And then I have two text blocks here. And again, I have anytime I add a bullet point, it's just automatically going to be that image because I've set up the CSS for the custom bullet point. And then just spacing it out here with a spacer block down below. So again, it's actually a really simple setup. But as I mentioned before, there's a cool Squarespace trick that removes padding from the bottom of a section. So let me change the background color here to better illustrate this. So you can see now that they're different colors, you can see these sections have no padding on, this one has no padding on the bottom and this one has no padding on the top. So it makes these feel really like they are part of the same section because you don't get all that section padding in between the two sections, making this content feel really far away from this content. So the way that you achieve that is there's a really quirky feature. If I edit the section, for some reason, when you have the content aligned to either the top or the bottom, if the section height is less than 20, then it removes the padding bottom from whichever you've aligned it. So because I've aligned this content to the bottom of the section and the section height is less than 20, this content or this section gets no padding on the bottom. So if I move it just up to 20 and then hit save, it doesn't look like there's any difference when in edit mode. But as soon as you save it, you can see that for some reason, like now the section has padding on the bottom, but if you change the section height to 19 or anything less than 19, then all of a sudden when you hit save, no more padding on the bottom. So that's the technique that I use to make sections like right on top of each other. So now this content feels much more integrated. And so I'm doing the same thing here on this section. So I'm aligning it to the top and I have the section height at 19, no more padding on the top. So once I flip the color back to tan, boom. It feels like this content, these blocks are right on top of each other because they actually are. So that's the technique that I'm using here as well to make this shape feel like it's right under this text. I'm just aligning it to the bottom. I have a section height really small of 10. And then here I'm aligned the content to the top. And again, I have a really small section height of 10. So that's how you can make two different sections feel cohesive and like they are part of a single section. And so again, I've added CSS to remove the padding right on this section. So as we go down to mobile, this is an image block, so it scales perfectly and it sticks to the right-hand edge of the screen. Again, we haven't added any CSS to style the mobile view. This is just working perfectly because of how it was set up. Here's the only problem when you have two different text blocks like this. When the blocks stack, this block has padding bottom and the other block has padding on the top. So I would have to do a media query and target that content to remove the padding bottom on this block and then remove the padding top of the next text block. So like if I went padding top 0, it would move up. And then if I went padding bottom, then it looks like it's now part of a single list. So that's an example of I would have to write actually specific CSS for mobile to fix that issue of them being in two separate text blocks. Just not something that I've done quite yet. So for the next section, I already sort of mentioned it when I was talking about the previous section, but this background image, I've just saved those X's at the very top with a little sliver of tan so that these X's feel like they're splitting the sections. Then I've changed the focal point all the way to the top, and that way the X's are always in frame. Doesn't matter what the screen size is. When you move the focal point to the very top, that means the top of the image will always be in frame. And then here, are you ready to thrive? This is just text in a text block. I believe that was yellow in the mockup, so I'll just make that change really quick. So again, really simple section here. And I'm using a little CSS to add this arrow after the text, but this is just text in a text block. The next section here, I've just changed the section height all the way, done a custom height of 10, dragged it all the way down. And this is code for a marquee in a code block. I'll link the resource in the description down below and maybe even a little pop-up on the screen. But this was free code that he provides, so kudos to him. I'm going to link to that. So for the next section, let's hop back into Illustrator. So again, this is its own section. The marquee is its own section. And then here, when I was looking at this section here with these boxes, the best way to do boxes like this is an auto layout section. But the problem is the mockup calls for a title with an arrow above it. And I knew I wouldn't be able to do the arrow in an auto layout section because you can't drag blocks into auto layout sections. So I knew at that point that it was going to require me to actually have this content be in its own section and then have the auto layout section be its own section as well. So I was going to be splitting up this content where in the mockup it appears as if it's in one section, but I was going to be splitting it up into two. So I repeat this farther down the page as well. So this is actually one section here, and then the auto layout section is down below. So it's a good method, and I'll show you how I actually executed that. So I have a section here, I have an image block, and I have my text block. Not doing anything crazy for the section height, I'm just keeping it small. And then for the auto layout section, I have everything set up just like this. So I uploaded the icon as an image. Then we have the title and the description. And then we have the buttons here, and these buttons will go to links eventually. The only CSS that I had to use was to round the corners and add the borders. that CSS, I believe, also came from my CSS Toolbox course. So really simple setup here. And the nice thing about auto layout sections is they have built in, you can reduce the padding top all the way down to 0. So you have these small, medium, or large settings, but you also have these custom settings here. So what I was able to do was just remove the padding on the top by dragging it all the way down to 0. And that just moves that content all the way up to the very bottom of the next section. So it's sort of like the trick we were using with the regular sections, except this is perfect because it's actually built in. But now these two things feel, connected and like they're part of the same section. And again, I'm doing the exact same thing here. Image block for the arrow, title in its own section, and then down below have another auto layout section. For the logo grid section, what I did is I just ended up saving both kind of chunks of logos as one image, and then this chunk of logos as another image. And I just made sure that I saved, you can see I've saved a little bit of white space on the sides of the images. And that just makes sure that like this logo isn't touching this logo when they're next to each other. They feel spaced out properly. And then when you go down to mobile, the two clusters just kind of like stack on top of each other, which looks good. So a very simple solution there, nothing complex. Again, as I mentioned before in this section, it's its own section, and for the background, I've done the trick that I've been doing the whole time. I've saved a little bit of white with the arrow and then made the rest of the banner a solid color. Drag the focal point to the top so that this arrow is actually part of the background of this section here. Then in this testimonial section, this is a testimonial slider. It's a plugin. I'll link to that down below. I can't remember who created the plugin, but I just added a little bit of CSS to style it, and then I also added the circle with CSS behind it using a pseudo element, the same exact technique that I used to add the little decoration here to the gallery. So pseudo elements are really awesome for doing little decorative designs like that. And then for the background image, I just saved these shapes as part of the background image, so you can see them right there to the right. And then finally below that, we have this section. It's the last section that's on the main page. And I just have this image here is actually part of the background image. And then this is a text block here, again, using my custom bullet points, which are automatic, which is pretty cool. And then I have this as an image block here. And what I did for the background image is I just made sure the focal point was dragged to the right over here. And that ensures as the screen scales down, it prioritizes this blank space instead of having the text go over the image. The text is going to stay in this blank area. So as I go from a larger screen and resize it down, you'll see that it's almost as if like the image is kind of shrinking down with it, which is a good illusion. That's exactly what I wanted because the focal point is prioritizing this part of the image. And then eventually on mobile, when it goes all the way down, like you can hardly even see the image. So a really nice solution there, super easy. I just saved this image as part of the background image, and that allows it to go full width. And you can see I have a bunch of blank space saved here because I knew as the screen gets smaller, this text was going to get really tall and skinny compared to the space on the image. So I needed enough space saved into the image as the screen gets smaller. So I can demonstrate that. If I shrink down my window, you can see like I needed that extra space saved in the image when it gets to screen sizes like this. And the reason that I could do a background image for this section and I couldn't in the first section is because of that tagline here. If we didn't have to worry about the tagline, then we probably wouldn't have had to worry about this image. But the other thing is there's not a lot of content in this section, so I thought it was nice to have this image on mobile below this content. Otherwise, this first section would have been pretty bare. Whereas down here, this section has a lot of content and it can stand on its own and it doesn't necessarily need her image again, especially because we already have her farther up the page. So that's why I use two different approaches, even though it's basically the same design. You can see the results of the two different approaches there. Then finally, this is the footer now. So we have this opt-in section. Eventually there will be an image of the opt-in over here. This is just a newsletter block with CSS from my toolbox course, and it styles it to make it an underline as opposed to the clunky default boxes. Oh, okay, so this is the last section on the page. And then in the footer, we have an Instagram block. So eventually this will connect to her Instagram, and that'll just be 6 images all the way across the footer. And then for the actual footer, this is just a logo. And then these are just text blocks. So nothing fancy in the footer. So if I click save, you can see what the footer looks like. Pretty straightforward. And then I also have this back to top button that came from my CSS Toolbox course as well. So that was a lot to cover. I hope this was helpful. Leave me feedback in the comments down below if you want to see more kind of strategic builds like this and see my process in attacking mockups. If you are a Squarespace web designer and you want to watch more content like this, I do Squarespace web design and CSS tricks for Squarespace. So consider subscribing, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.